What happens when Hollywood's most enigmatic star comes face to face with late-night television's most ruthless interrogator? You won't believe what unfolds when Johnny Depp sits down with Stephen Colbert for what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of The Late Show was supposed to be business as usual. Johnny Depp promoting his latest film project, sharing some laughs, maybe playing a game or two. Instead, viewers witnessed a complete meltdown that ended with security being called and one of cinema's biggest names storming off set in a rage that left the studio audience in stunned silence. The tension was palpable from the moment Depp walked onto that stage. His signature swagger seemed more guarded than usual, his trademark smile appearing forced as he settled into the guest chair across from Colbert. The host, known for his sharp wit and occasionally cutting commentary, had that particular glint in his eye that regular viewers know all too well, the look that says he's loaded for bear and ready to pounce. "Johnny Depp, everyone," Colbert announced with his characteristic enthusiasm. But there was something different in his tone, something that made the applause feel hollow. "Thanks for being here, Johnny. I have to say, it's been quite a journey watching your career over the past few years." Depp's jaw visibly tightened at those words. "Thanks for having me, Stephen," he replied, his voice carrying that familiar rasp, but with an edge that hadn't been there during his previous late-night appearances. "Though I have a feeling this isn't going to be your typical chat about my latest movie." "Well, you know me," Colbert said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I like to dig a little deeper than the surface. Speaking of your latest movie, it's interesting timing, isn't it? Coming back to major Hollywood productions after everything that's happened. Some might call it a comeback story." The word comeback hung in the air like a challenge. Depp's fingers drummed against the armrest of his chair, a nervous habit that fans had noticed in his more uncomfortable interviews over the years. "I wouldn't call it a comeback, Stephen. I never really went anywhere. The work speaks for itself." "Does it, though?" Colbert pressed, leaning forward slightly. "I mean, let's be honest here, Johnny. The past few years haven't exactly been smooth sailing for you professionally. Studios were hesitant, projects were shelved, roles were recast. That sounds like someone who went somewhere to me." The studio audience, initially excited to see one of their favorite actors, began to sense the shift in atmosphere. The usual warmth of a late-night talk show was rapidly cooling into something more resembling a cross-examination. Depp's publicist, visible in the wings, looked increasingly uncomfortable as Colbert continued his line of questioning. "Look, Stephen," Depp said, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "The entertainment industry is complicated. There are politics involved that go way beyond just making movies. Sometimes narratives get pushed that don't reflect reality." "Narratives," Colbert repeated, seizing on the word like a prosecutor who just heard a key piece of testimony. "That's an interesting word choice. Are you saying the media created a false narrative about you? That all those headlines, all those court documents, all of that was just, fake news?" The question hit like a sledgehammer. Depp's eyes flashed with something dangerous, and for a moment, the charming movie star facade cracked completely. "I'm saying that the truth is rarely as simple as what you read in the tabloids, Stephen. And I'm frankly surprised that someone of your supposed intelligence would reduce complex personal situations to tabloid soundbites." A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't the playful banter they'd come to expect from Colbert's show. This was something rawer, more personal, and infinitely more uncomfortable. Colbert, however, seemed to be enjoying every second of it. "My supposed intelligence?" Colbert laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Well, that's quite the backhanded compliment, Johnny. But you're right. I do try to be intelligent about these things, which is why I actually read those court documents, all of them. And I have to say, some of the details were illuminating." Depp's hands clenched into fists. Those documents were taken out of context, twisted by lawyers trying to win a case. You of all people should understand how facts can be manipulated for entertainment value. "Entertainment value?" Colbert's voice rose slightly, and the mask of the genial host began to slip entirely. "Is that what you think this is? Entertainment? Because I think accountability is pretty serious business, don't you?" The air in the studio had become electric with tension. Camera operators exchanged glances. Producers in the control room leaned forward in their chairs, and the audience sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply leave. This was no longer a talk show appearance, it was a public reckoning, and everyone present could feel it. Depp stood up suddenly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. "Accountability?" he said, his voice rising to match Colbert's. "You want to talk about accountability, Stephen? Let's talk about your accountability. Let's talk about how you've built a career on tearing people down from behind a desk, how you hide behind comedy to say things you'd never have the courage to say to someone's face." Colbert's eyes narrowed. "I'm saying it to your face right now, aren't I?" "Yeah, you are." Depp shot back, taking a step closer to the host's desk. "And it's about damn time someone called you out for what you really are. Not a comedian, not a journalist, just another vulture feeding off other people's pain for ratings." The studio fell completely silent, except for the hum of the cameras, still rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming the most explosive confrontation in late-night television history. But this was only the beginning, and what happened next would leave everyone in that studio questioning everything they thought they knew about both men. Colbert rose from behind his desk, his famous composure cracking like ice under pressure. "A vulture?" he repeated, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You want to talk about vultures, Johnny? Let's talk about someone who spent decades playing the victim while the people around him suffered. Let's talk about someone who thinks talent excuses everything." The accusations hit Depp like physical blows. His face flushed red, and the charming pirate persona that had made him millions was nowhere to be found. In its place stood a man pushed to his absolute breaking point. "You don't know what you're talking about, Stephen. You sit up there in your ivory tower, judging people you've never met, situations you've never experienced." "I know what I read in sworn testimony," Colbert fired back, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the studio. "I know what I saw in those audio recordings. I know what juries decided. And I know that standing here now, looking at you, I see someone who still doesn't get it." The mention of audio recordings was the match that lit the powder keg. Depp's eyes blazed with a fury that seemed to consume him entirely. Those recordings were illegally obtained and edited. "You're talking about private moments between two people who were destroying each other. You think that gives you the right to pass judgment? When those private moments involve alleged abuse, yes, I think the public has a right to know," Colbert shot back without missing a beat. "When someone uses their platform and their fame to potentially harm others, then yes, accountability matters more than your comfort level with difficult questions." The audience was frozen in their seats, witnessing something that felt more like a street fight than television entertainment. Some people held up their phones, recording what they instinctively knew would become viral within hours. Others looked toward the exits, unsure if they should stay or leave. "You want to talk about using platforms to harm people?" Depp snarled, pointing an accusatory finger at Colbert. "What do you call this? What do you call ambushing a guest on live television with accusations and half-truths? What do you call turning what was supposed to be a promotional appearance into a public execution?" Colbert's laugh was cold and humorless. "I call it journalism, Johnny. I call it asking the questions that other people are too starstruck or too afraid to ask. Maybe you're just not used to being held accountable by someone who isn't on your payroll." "Journalism?" Depp's voice cracked with incredulous rage. "This isn't journalism. This is tabloid garbage dressed up with a fancy set and a live audience. You're no better than the paparazzi who chase people down the street for a photograph." "At least, I don't hide behind lawyers and NDAs," Colbert retorted, his composure completely gone now. "At least I have the guts to say what I think to someone's face instead of sending threatening messages through intermediaries." The reference to threatening messages seemed to hit a particular nerve. Depp's entire body tensed, and for a terrifying moment, it looked like he might actually lunge across the space separating them. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that the sensitive studio microphones picked up perfectly. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Stephen. None. You've never been where I've been. You've never faced what I've faced. And you sure as hell have never had to watch everything you've worked for your entire life get torn apart by people who weren't there, don't know you, and frankly don't care about the truth. The truth? Colbert stepped around his desk completely now, abandoning any pretense of maintaining his host persona. The truth is that you've spent years playing the victim, while real victims had to fight just to be heard. The truth is that you've used your fame and your money to try to silence anyone who dared to speak out against you. That's a lie! Depp exploded, his voice echoing through the studio with such force that several audience members visibly jumped. I've never tried to silence anyone. I've tried to defend myself against lies and slander, which apparently is a crime in your book. Defend yourself by suing your ex-wife for $50 million. Colbert shot back immediately. Defend yourself by dragging every intimate detail of your relationship through the courts for the world to see. That's not defense, Johnny. That's revenge. And everyone watching this right now knows it. The mention of the lawsuit was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. Depp's hands shook with fury as he struggled to find words that could adequately express his outrage. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely controlled chaos. That lawsuit was about clearing my name. It was about fighting back against years of character, assassination, and lies. But you wouldn't understand that, would you, Stephen? You've never had to watch your children read headlines about their father that weren't true. You've never had to explain to people you love why strangers on the internet think you're a monster. Maybe they think that because of your actions, not because of headlines, Colbert replied ruthlessly. Maybe the problem isn't the media, Johnny. Maybe the problem is looking back at you in the mirror every morning. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The audience could feel the moment when something fundamental shifted in the confrontation, when it moved beyond professional disagreement or even personal animosity into something much darker and more dangerous. Depp's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and finally, a cold rage that seemed to settle over him like armor. You know what, Stephen? Depp said quietly, but his voice carried clearly through the dead, silent studio. I've met a lot of self-righteous hypocrites in my life, but you might just take the prize. Sitting there behind your desk, playing judge and jury, acting like you're some kind of moral authority, when really, you're just another entertainer desperate for ratings. Colbert's eyes flashed dangerously. At least I'm not desperate enough to destroy the people closest to me for my own ego. The accusation was so brutal, so personal, that it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Depp stared at Colbert for a long moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly, and then something in his expression changed completely. The anger was still there, but now it was accompanied by something much more frightening, a kind of cold, calculating fury that suggested this confrontation was about to reach a point from which there would be no return. You want to talk about destroying people, Stephen? Depp's voice was now eerily calm, which somehow made it more menacing than his earlier shouting. Let's talk about what you do every single night. You sit behind that desk and you tear people apart for entertainment. You've made a career out of mocking and humiliating anyone who doesn't fit your narrow worldview. Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but Depp held up a hand, his eyes never leaving the host's face. No, you've had your say. Now it's my turn. You think you're some kind of crusader for justice, but really you're just a bully with a television show. You pick targets you know won't fight back. People who need the publicity too much to walk away. The studio audience was completely transfixed, watching what felt like a verbal execution taking place before their eyes. Some were recording on their phones, others sat with their mouths agape, and a few had actually started to leave, unable to handle the intensity of what they were witnessing. The difference between us, Stephen, Depp continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction with every word, is that I've never pretended to be something I'm not. I've never hidden behind false righteousness or claimed moral superiority while destroying people for ratings. I've made mistakes, yes. I've struggled, yes. But I've never been a coward. Colbert's face had gone pale, but his stubborn pride wouldn't let him back down. A coward? That's rich coming from someone who what? Depp interrupted, taking another step closer. Who fought back when attacked? Who refused to roll over and play dead when people tried to destroy everything I'd built? You call that cowardice? I call that survival. You call it survival. I call it abusive behavior. Colbert shot back, his voice cracking slightly. I call it using your power and influence to intimidate and silence people who dare to cross you. The word abusive seemed to hit Depp like a physical blow. but instead of breaking him, it appeared to crystallize something inside him. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet but carried to every corner of the silent studio. "Abusive," he repeated slowly. "You want to see abusive, Stephen? Abusive is what you've done here tonight. Abusive is inviting someone onto your show under false pretenses and then ambushing them with a coordinated character assassination. Abusive is using your platform to humiliate someone for your own entertainment and career advancement." Depp moved closer to Colbert's desk, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the host actually took a step backward. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Stephen? You actually had talent once. You were funny, you were clever, you had something meaningful to say. But somewhere along the way, you sold out. You traded wit for cruelty, intelligence for cheap shots, and comedy for bloodsport. I won't be lectured about integrity by someone who," Colbert began, but Depp cut him off with a harsh laugh. "By someone who what? By someone who's been through hell and came out the other side? By someone who's faced their demons in public and survived it? Yeah, Stephen, I think that gives me exactly the right to lecture you about integrity." The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both men now standing, facing each other across the narrow space that separated the guest area from the host's desk. The audience was completely silent, afraid to even breathe loudly enough to interrupt what felt like a moment of television history. "You want to know what really bothers me about you, Stephen?" Depp asked, his voice now carrying a tone of disgust rather than anger. "It's not the ambush. It's not even the character assassination. It's the fact that you do all of this while pretending to be the good guy. At least when tabloids destroy people, they don't pretend it's journalism. At least when vultures picket carrion, they don't claim to be eagles." Colbert's composure finally cracked completely. "How dare you come onto my show and your show?" Depp laughed bitterly. "This isn't your show, Stephen. This is a circus. And you're just the ringmaster of a freak show. The only difference is that the freaks in your circus are real people with real lives that you destroy for applause." "Security!" Colbert suddenly called out, his voice shaking with rage and what might have been fear. "Security!" But Depp was already moving, striding toward the edge of the stage with the kind of dramatic flair that had made him a movie star. "Don't worry, Stephen. I wouldn't stay in this cesspool another second if you paid me. But before I go, let me leave you and your audience with something to think about." He turned back to face Colbert, and then looked directly into the camera, addressing not just the studio audience but the millions watching at home. "This is what passes for entertainment in America today. This is what we've become. A society that feeds on other people's pain, that turns human suffering into ratings, that rewards cruelty, and calls it comedy." Depp's eyes moved back to Colbert, who was standing behind his desk like it was a shield. "You had a choice tonight, Stephen. You could have used this platform to do something meaningful, something that elevated both of us and everyone watching. Instead, you chose to try to tear me down to build yourself up. That says everything anyone needs to know about who you really are." The security guards had finally appeared at the edge of the stage, but they hesitated, unsure whether to approach or wait for further instructions. Depp noticed them and smiled grimly. "Don't worry, gentlemen. I'm leaving. I've got more important things to do than waste another second in this toxic environment." He looked back at Colbert one final time. "Good luck living with yourself, Stephen. I hope the ratings were worth your soul." With that, Johnny Depp walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a speechless host, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked about moments in late-night television history. The cameras continued rolling, as Colbert stood frozen behind his desk, the weight of what had just transpired settling over the studio like a heavy blanket. As the sound of Depp's footsteps faded, and the studio doors slammed shut behind him, the only sound left was the mechanical whir of the cameras and the collective intake of breath from an audience that had just witnessed something they would never forget. The interview was over, but the fallout from this explosive confrontation would reverberate far beyond the walls of that studio, forever changing how people viewed both men and the nature of celebrity interviews themselves.